All right, so um, fourth section of chapter 2, the condition of women and first class oppression. The genus of emancipatory class struggles includes a third species. There is another social group that is so numerous as to form or exceed half of the population, a special group that suffers autocracy and waits its emancipation. Women. Weighing on them is the domestic oppression exercised by the male. I am citing the text published by Engels in 1884. It is true that Marx had died the previous year, but as early as 1845, the German ideology, a text which Engels explicitly refers, observed that in the patriarchal family, wife, children are slaves of the husband. In its turn, the Communist Manifesto, which criticized the bourgeoisie for reducing the proletariat to the condition of a machine and instrument of labor, observes that the bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. So, the real point aimed at it is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. The category used to define the condition of the worker in the capitalist factory is now applied to the social condition of woman in the patriarchal family. Taken as a whole, the capitalist system presents itself as a set of more or less servile relations imposed by one people on another intentionally, by one class on another in an individual country, and by men on women within one and the same class. We can now understand the thesis formulated by Engels drawing on Fourier, which was also maintained by Marx, namely that women's emancipation was the natural measure of the general emancipation. For better or worse, the relationship between men and women is a kind of microcosm reflecting the total social order. In largely pre modern Russia, subject to ruthless repression by their masters, the peasants, Marx observed, proceeded in their turn to awful beatings to death of their wives. Or take the capitalist factory. While it affected all workers, the owner's despotic power was experienced by women in especially degrading fashion. His mill is also his harem. It is not difficult to find voices denouncing the oppressive character of the female condition in the culture of the time. In 1790, Condorcet defined the exclusion of women from political rights as an act of tyranny. The following year, the Declaration of Rights of Women and the Female Citizens, whose author was Olympe de Gouges, drew attention in Article 4 to the perpetual tyranny imposed by men on women. More than half a century later, John Stuart Mill in Britain referred to the slavery of women, domestic tyranny, and legally sanctioned actual bondage. But what were the causes of this oppression and of the widespread indifference to it? Condorcet condemned the power of habit, which dulled the sense of justice even in enlightened men. Mill argued in a similar vein, referring to a set of customs, prejudices, and superstitions that needed to be overcome or neutralized, through a sound psychology. Although alluding to social relations, these were confined to social relations between the two sexes, which sanctioned the slavery or subaltern status of women on account of inferiority in muscular strength and the survival in the context of the law of the strongest. The connection between the condition of women and other forms of oppression was not investigated. In fact, in Mills's view, the man-woman relationship was portrayed as a kind of island where the logic of subjugation, which had largely disappeared in other contexts, persisted. Quote, "We now live, that is to say, one or two of the most advanced nations of the world now live, in a state which the law of the stronger seems to be entirely abandoned as the regulating principle of the world's affairs." End quote. From Marx and Engels' standpoint, by contrast, the relationship between capitalist metropolis and colonies was more than ever one of domination and subjugation, and in the capitalist metropolis itself, economic but not now legal coercion continued to govern relation between capital and labor. It was Mary Wollstonecraft who combined the denunciation of the slavish dependence reserved for women with indictment of the existing social order. Male domination seemed to go hand in hand with the Ancien regime, While champions of the struggle for the abolition of slavery singled out the aristocracy of the epidermis or the nobility of the skin, the feminist militant targeted what, in her view, took the form of the aristocratic power of males. The enunciation of it was combined with condemnation of hereditary riches and inherited honors, with the condemnation of preposterous distinction of rank. In any event, women would not be freed till the ranks are confounded and till more equality be established in society. At times, the British feminists and Jacobin seemed to challenge capitalist society itself. Women ought to have representatives instead of being arbitrarily governed without having any direct share allowed to them in the deliberation of the government. But it should not be forgotten that in Britain, workers too were excluded from political rights, as the whole system of repression is now, in the country, only a convenient handle for despotism. Women need not complain, for they are as well represented as numerous classes of hardworking mechanics who pay for the support of royalty when they can scarcely stop their children's mouth with bread. The condition of workers and the condition of women had things in common, as was the case for members of the working class. The few employment open to women, so far from being liberal, are menial. Ultimately, the wide range critique of the relation of domination, characteristic of the existing social order, women themselves must learn to question things. Instead, they displayed folly in the manner in which they treat servants in the presence of children, permitting them to suppose that they ought to wait on them and bear their humors. The English Jacobin, who constituted a brilliant exception, seems in a way to anticipate Marx and Engels, who established the link between the division of labor in the family and the division of labor in society. Engels, in particular, formulated the thesis that the modern individual family is based on the overt or covert domestic slavery of the woman. In any event, the man is the bourgeois, the wife represents the proletariat. Of Marx and Engels' contemporary, the one who developed an analysis that might be compared with theirs, albeit with a converse value judgment, was not Mill but Nietzsche. The implacable critic of revolution, as such, including the feminist revolution, compared the condition of women to that of sufferers of the lower classes, slave laborers, or prisoners, and indirectly equated the feminist movement, the workers' movement, and the abolitionist movement. All three were on the lookout for everything slave-like, serf-like, in order to indignantly denounce it, as if registering its existence did not serve to confirm that slavery was a condition of every higher culture. Obviously, the theme of the link between the subjection of women and social oppression as a whole was developed much more amply and organically by Engels, with reference to the German ideology, co-written by him with Marx and long unpublished. Quote, the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male, end quote. This was a state of affairs with a long history behind it that had not yet arrived at its terminus. Quote, the overthrow of mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. The man seized reins of the house too. The woman was degraded, enthralled, became the slave of the man's lust, a mere instrument for breeding children. This humiliated position of women has become gradually embellished and dissembled, and in part clothed in milder form, but by no means abolished. End quote. We'll do one more section. Section 5, the class struggle of the exploiting class. I have hitherto been concerned with the three major emancipatory class struggles, which are set to radically alter the division of labor and the relations of exploitation and oppression that obtain internationally in a single country and within the family. But we must not lose sight of the struggle whose protagonists are the exploited classes. Let us see how in November 1848, Marx summarized the key events of that year. Quote, in Naples, The Lazzaroni are leagued with the monarchy against the bourgeoisie. In Paris, the greatest struggle ever known in history is taking place. The bourgeoisie is leagued with the Lazzaroni against the working class. End quote. The struggle, whereby a feudal reaction, availing itself of the support of lumpen elements, suppressed the democratic bourgeois revolution in Naples, is likewise class struggle, and so is the ruthless repression with which the French bourgeoisie, thanks again to the support of the urban lumpen proletariat, quelled the desperation and rebellion of Parisian workers in the June days. Finally, let us return one last time to Laundrette's testimony. In any confirmation of the clear, frank theory of class struggle professed by Marx and his family circle, he added a further detail. Quote, in this house, people never hesitate to take sides in conflicts where different fractions of the bourgeoisie can be recognized. End quote. As we can see, class struggle is mentioned even in connection with conflicts between different fractions of the bourgeoisie. That is, conflicting, pitting exploited classes or fractions of them against one another. As the manifesto stresses, the bourgeois finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. Where the struggle against the aristocracy prompted the revolution heralding the collapse of the Ancien regime, economic competition between the bourgeoisies of different capitalist countries can issue in an industrial war of extermination between nations. Reference is probably being made here to the wars of the Napoleonic era, whose main protagonists were the two countries, Britain and France, that had left behind the Ancien regime and fought on several continents for control of the world market. However, while it outlines a historical balance sheet of the past, the extermination in which the class struggle between opposing capitalist bourgeois results calls to mind the carnage of the First World War, which occurred more than 60 years ago. Occurred more than 60 years after the publication of the manifesto. Let's see how long this one is. Okay, I think we can do section 6 too. All right, section 6. So 1848 to 9, a class struggle in colossal political forms. The intricate picture of class struggle, which is beginning to emerge, is not yet complete. We have seen them in operation in abstraction from one another. However, a concrete historical situation, especially a major historical crisis, is characterized by the conjunction of multiple contradictory class struggles. We may look at the major historical crisis witnessed by the authors of the Communist Manifesto. We possess two balance sheets of the revolutionary years of 1848 through 9, both written on the spur of the moment by Marx. The first, from April 1849, is contained in the Wage, Labor, and Capital, which, to judge from its title, should deal with a more strictly economic and trade union subject. In reality, Marx situates everyday class struggle in the context of the upheavals underway, the defeat of revolutionary workers, the heroic wars of independence, and the desperate exertion of Poland, Italy, and Hungary's, the emergence on the horizon of a possible world war, which will see the proletariat revolution and the feudalistic counter-revolution ranged against one another, the starving of Ireland, the terrible famine that decimated the island's inhabitants and which was created by the distinguished representatives of the British ruling class as an act of providence. Jesus. The contribution made in their different ways by Britain and Russia to the crushing of the revolutionary movement, and hence the relapse of Europe into the old double slavery, the Anglo-Russian slavery, with the commercial subjugation and exploitation of the bourgeois class of the various European nations by the despot of the world market, England. Thus, the world has seen the class struggle develop in colossal political forms in 1848, Nothing was alien to the class struggle and the European Revolution. Rather than presenting itself in directly economic guise, the class struggle had resumed the most varied political forms. Working class and the popular revolts, national insurrections, repression unleashed by domestic and international reaction, with recourse to the military or economic tools. Far from disappearing, it had become more acuter. The second historical balance sheet is drawn up in class struggle in France. The date was 1850, and in Marx's view, the crisis had not yet reached a conclusion and might, in fact, open up new grandiose revolutionary prospects. Quote, the defeat of June of the Parisian workers divulged to the despotic powers of Europe the secret that France must maintain peace abroad at any price in order to be able to wage civil war at home. Thus, the people who had begun to fight for their natural independence were abandoned to the superior power Russia, Austria, and Prussia. But at the same time, the fate of these national revolutions was made subject to the fate of the proletarian revolution, and they were robbed of their apparent autonomy, their independence, of great social revolution. The Hungarian shall not be free, nor the Pole, nor the Italian, as long as the worker remains a slave. Finally, with the victory of the Holy Alliance, Europe has taken on a form in which every fresh proletariat upheaval in France directly involves a world war. The new French Revolution is forced to leave its national soil forthwith and conquer the European terrain, on which alone the social revolution of the 19th century can be accomplished. End quote. An intervention by the counter-revolutionary powers similar to that of 1792 was to be anticipated. Consequently, the class war with French society turned into a world war in which the nations confront one another. Here, revolutionary impatience tends imaginatively to run ahead of a long historical process, but I would mainly like to examine the theoretical and categorical aspect. What is configured as class war is world war, a nexus of revolutions and international conflicts. Clearly, 1848 through 9 reminded Marx of the historical crisis that began in 1789. Starting from the invasion of France by powers committed to defending the Ancien regime, it too saw revolutions and international conflict intersect and converge in a global or European war. The most relevant novel factor in the new crisis was its protagonists were no longer two social subjects, but three. In addition to the aristocracy and bourgeoisie, there was not the proletariat, which, Marx hoped, might play a decisive role in reversing, over and above the Ancien regime, capitalism itself. At all events, in both historical crises, assuming a different form each time, class struggle explored in colossal political forms, and class war ended up taking the form of a world war. Class struggle almost never presents itself in the pure state, almost never confines itself to involve directly antagonistic subjects. Above all, it is precisely thanks to this lack of purity that it can issue in a victorious social revolution. Marx envisioned a proletariat insurrection occurring in the most developed capitalist country. Counter-revolutionary intervention would then target Britain, where, however, the weight of the working class was menacing from the perspective of power, determined to preserve the existing order at any cost. In the course of the World War, or the novel conjunction of revolutions and wars that would detonate it, conditions would thus be created conducive to an event that was designed to signal a turning point in world history. The proletariat is pushed to the fore in the nation which dominates the world market, to the forefront in England. The revolution, which finds here not its end, but its organizational beginning, is no short-lived revolution. End quote. In its time, the feudal powers The feudal powers' intervention against revolutionary France had prompted the Jacobin radicalization, had presaged the arrival in power of a political and ideological stratum not organically connected to the bourgeoisie, and which, in fact, the bourgeoisie only managed to reabsorb later with difficulty. A potential counter-revolutionary intervention against Britain, while it was immersed in revolutionary crisis, could end up setting in motion a similar process, requiring socialists in that eventuality to direct their energies to the defense of both social conquest and national independence. While the occasionally fantastic character of the scenario sketched by Marx in 1850 is evident, what is undeniable is the almost prophetic foresight it displays. During major historical crises, which are characterized by a conjunction of domestic and international conflicts, the class struggle intensifies and becomes a revolutionary struggle in a country invested by an unprecedented national crisis. This was a scenario also evoked by the late Engels. In a letter of October 13, 1895 to August Bebel, he understood the growing dangers of war. What would happen if Germany, where the strongest social party was active, were to be attacked by Tsarist Russia? And the national existence threatened? It might happen that, in contrast to the cowardice of the bourgeoisie and junkers who want to save their property, we should turn out to be the only vigorous war party. Of course, it might also happen that we should have to take the helm and do a 1794 in order to chuck out the Russian and their allies. This is a passage which was invoked by German social democracy in 1914 to justify its support for imperialist war. A decisively bizarre reference which indirectly compared the Germany of Wilhelm II with the France of Robespierre. But it is the case that a key aspect of 20th century was the blossoming of national liberation movements that ended up being hegemonized by communist or communist-inspired parties. And the development of these movements was precisely punctuated by two world wars wherein the aspect of the counter-revolutionary intervention was more or less massively present. The intervention of the Entente against Soviet Russia was followed more than 20 years later by the aggression of the Hitlerite Germany, which simultaneously aimed to liquidate the socialist movement and build a colonial empire in the East. As a result of which defeat of this project provoked an immense wave of anti-colonial revolutions on a global scale. Once again, to adopt Marxist terminology, we witnessed the class war develop in a colossal political form, and class war configured as world war. I think oh, one more. 7, 1865 to 5, a crusade of property against labor. More than 2 decades after the revolutionary crisis of 1848-9, Marx and Engels were witnesses of the tragedy of the Paris Commune. In this instance, however, the clash between bourgeoisie and proletariat was obviously to everyone, if only on account of the execution squads mobilized by the former against the latter. We must concern ourselves with a more complex historical sequence, which they follow from an observation post located thousands of miles away. I'm referring to the American Civil War, which Volume 1 of Capital published in 1867 characterized as the one great event of contemporary history. This phrase recalls that used in connection with the Parisian workers' June insurrections of 1848, characterized as the most colossal event in the history of European civil wars. Capital establishes a parallel between the Civil War and the struggle against working conditions that effectively force workers to work to death. If the abolition of slavery was a result of the American Civil War, analogously, the legal limitation and regulation of the working day had been wrung step by step after a civil war of half a century. While the Emancipation Proclamation banned the purchase and sale of black slaves in the USA, in Europe, legal regulations of the working day prevented workers from selling by voluntary contract with capital themselves and their families into slavery and death. If, across the Atlantic, the election of Lincoln, suspected of being an abolitionist, was followed by the secession of the slave-holding states, British capitalists reacted to the reduction and regulation of working hours with pro-slavery rebellion in miniature, agitating in defense of the maintenance of wage slavery in its pure form. In both instances, we are dealing with class struggle, waged at once from below and from above. In the USA, especially in the final phases of the war, the ranks of the Union were swollen by an influx of slaves or ex-slaves who abandoned their masters or ex-masters who helped defeat the pro-slavery recession, while in Britain, working class agitation went back a long way. In both countries, the reformist bourgeoisie played an important role. We're dealing with an emancipatory class struggle that does not present itself in the pure state as a clash between exploited and exploiter, oppressed and oppressor. The impure character of the American Civil War was even more marked and manifest, not only because the contestants were not, at least for sight, a ruling class and an oppressed class. Furthermore, the North was far from being motivated by pure abolitionist zeal. Lincoln himself guaranteed slaveholding states peaceful enjoyment of self-government if they were prepared to display loyalty to the Union. To justify their sympathy for the South, sizable sections of the British bourgeoisie invoked this, arguing as follows: the Union was fighting primarily for protectionist custom tariffs and to defend its territorial integrity. Prominent figures in the socialist movement adopted a not dissimilar position. Was a bloodbath justified merely to indulge the industrial bourgeoisie of the North against the landowning aristocracy of the South, or to replace one exploiting class with another and spread wage slavery by removing classical slavery? Was what was at stake seem at all the more vile, given that the material conditions of wage slaves were no better than those of slaves proper at the time? Capping it all was the hypocrisy for which substantial sections of the British working class criticized abolitionists in their country. The latter were moved by the lot of black slaves across the Atlantic, but remained impervious in the face of the tragedy of white slaves in their own backyard. Marx was well aware of the limitations of British abolitionism. In Capital, he expressed utter contempt for the ideal typical figure of the Duchess of Sutherland. The noble lady entertained Mrs. Beecher Stowe, authoress of Uncle Tom's Cabin, with great magnificence in London, to show her sympathy for the Negro slaves of the American Republic. At the same time, however, she was ruthless towards her own slaves, who were systematically hunted and rooted out of their lands and condemned to die of hunger and sometimes swept away along with the village inhabited by them. With the villages inhabited by them. Nevertheless, from his first article in the New York Daily Tribune, which appeared in 11 October 1861, Marx sharply rejected such arguments. It was true that Lincoln had confirmed that he sought only to preserve the territorial integrity of the USA, but the South, on its part, inaugurated the war by loudly proclaiming the peculiar institution as the only and main end of the rebellion. Besides, the Constitution of the Confederacy had recognized for the first time slavery as a thing good in itself, a bulwark of civilization and divine institution. If the North professed to fight for the Union, the South glorified in rebellion for the supremacy of slavery. Hence, what was at stake was clear: the defense or abolition of the Southern slavocracy. As we can see, we are witness to a surprise inversion of positions. Resorting to ideology critique of an economistic and reductionist kind were the pro-South sectors of the British ruling class, while highlighting the abolitionist significance and virtue of the Northerners' war was Marx, the great and caustic critic of ideology. For what reasons? I shall try to summarize why, for Marx, the Union's war to suppress slaveholding and secession took the form of a gigantic emancipatory class struggle. 1. A society dominated by an oligarchy where all the productive labors dissolve onto the N-word had to be defeated. It has been justly observed, for most of human history, the expression free labor was an oxymoron. This contradiction in terms was especially crying in the years before the Civil War in the American Deep South, where, in Tocqueville's words, labor is confounded with the ideal of slavery. Breaking with this tradition entailed conferring dignity on the very idea of labor and achieving on an important the ideological victory. Above all, emancipating the labor branded in the black skin of slavery proper, the Union's abolitionist war on the slaveholding secessionist South had created more conditions, more properties for the emancipation of labor in the white skin. All the more so because the slaveholders' rebellion was to sound the tocsin for a general holy crusade of property against labor. With this observation, Marx hit the nail on the head. In the very midst of the Civil War, one of the South's most distinguished theorists, George Fitzhugh, although legitimating the subjection of blacks and regarding it as a necessary and beneficial, criticized the idea of confining the justification of slavery to race. In Europe, meanwhile, echoing these themes and situating them in the framework of a developed philosophy of history, Nietzsche celebrated slavery as such, not necessarily racial slavery, as the ineliminable foundation of civilization. 2. When he maintained that the institution of slavery was required to regulate the relationship between capital and labor as such, Fitzhugh probably had in mind the expeditions of the filibusters who set out to form the South to export slavery to countries of Central America, expeditions aimed at the conquest of new territory for the spread of slavery and of the slaveholders' rule. In fact, in the years leading up to the Civil War, William Walker had set out at the head of a small army of adventurers to conquer Nicaragua, reintroduce black slavery there, restart the slave trade, and impose forced labor on Nicaraguans themselves. We can now understand the message of congratulations drafted by Marx in January 1865 and sent by the International to Lincoln on the occasion of his re-election. Quote, "From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. They realized that their hopes for the culture, even their past conquests, were at stake in the tremendous conflict on the other side of the Atlantic." End quote. 3. With the abolition of black slavery, the Civil War ended in the emancipation, albeit partial, of an oppressed race or nationality. And from this standpoint, too, it took the form of a major class struggle. In the final phase of its existence, the Confederacy was obliged to retreat from its original position and treat the Negro soldiers as prisoners of war, rather than shooting them as rebel slaves and barbarians excluded from the Jus Publicum Europaeum. In addition, Marx stressed that bound up with the abolition of slavery in the USA was recognition by Washington of the independence of the Negro Republic of Liberia and Haiti. Of particular significance was the recognition of Haiti, which was born in the wake of the Great Black Slave Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture and long subject to diplomatic isolation and economic strangulations by the USA and the West. For all these reasons, Marx declared the Civil War was as amongst the most important chapters in the class struggle of his time. The slave owners' bid to assert or reassert the identity between labor and slavery, the Crusade of Property against labor, suffered a defeat whose significance transcended the borders of the USA and the black race. Unfortunately, the defeat of pro-slavery counter-revolution was only partial, and attempts to stage a comeback under the sign of white supremacy were soon forthcoming. But for Marx, this was further confirmation that the gigantic class struggle, which exploded between 1861 and 1865, was far from over. Okay, I think we're good here. We'll stop in section 8 and continue to go.